Have a good talk.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Different setting this time. My name is Joel Berger. I am a member of the Mojolicious core team. Speaking to you today from my house, and I can't wait to see you guys all again sometime very soon. I called this talk Awaiting Mojolicious, and that sort of gives away the punchline at the end, if you know what the punchline will be. But actually, this talk has a lot of introductory material too, so hopefully this will be good for everybody, whether you use Mojo or not. About this talk, my style of talks, I know everyone else is kind of going to these very little code in talks. My style of talk has lots of code. And that means that if you'd like to have a local copy up and running so that you can read along as you go, you can go to jberger.github.io/awaitingmojolicious. I am in fact doing that myself. This is the talk I am giving. All of the code you see is also included in the repo. All the code, whether or not you see all of it on the slide, all of the code is complete and runs as shown, and all of the tests pass. Please all pass. Hooray. Outline of the talk, I'm going to do a little brief introduction to the Mojolicious project, then an interview of some of the Mojo Toolkit pieces that we will be using. I will then iteratively build up a non-trivial Mojolicious app, and that app itself will come with tests, the tests that you just saw run. I won't pop over to the other console and show each individually, but you can assume they ran because you just saw it. I will use those individual steps to introduce some Mojolicious concepts, and then at the end, we will convert that app to non-blocking. When I say a non-trivial app, sometimes a trivial app is reasonably easy to convert to non-blocking using any mechanism you want. But with a non-trivial app, you can often pull your hair out. What is Mojolicious? Sort of my standard slide. It's an amazing real-time web framework. But it's also a powerful web development toolkit. You can use the toolkit without the framework. The framework uses the toolkit, so that doesn't really work the other way around. It has been designed from the ground up intentionally to work nicely with itself. It's very self-consistent, but it wasn't done in a vacuum. It was built based on years of experience that our lead developer, Sebastian Riedel, had developing Catalyst. The code, it's portable. It has no non-core dependencies, although it has several optional dependencies. It's batteries included. I very rarely have to duck out of the Mojo Toolkit for anything you can reasonably consider sort of standard web stuff. Real-time and non-blocking, it's built on an I/O loop. If you're familiar with Node.js, you'll feel very comfortable in Mojolicious. And WebSockets and things. We say it's perfect for building highly scalable web services. I often have exact numbers on these, how many lines of code and how many tests. I was polishing this up to the last second. I didn't have time to actually do a check. And in fact, right now we're importing our test suite to use subtests. So it's a little hard to get the exact number of tests out. We're trying to figure out a good way to do that because it's kind of fun to keep account of that number. But we like to show how much more testing we have than lines of code in the lib directory. Of course, it's easy to install, and you can do it with this curl line or via whatever CPAN mechanism that you already like. Getting help, mojolicious.org, or pound Mojo on Freenode. We did recently move, not so recently, I guess, from irc.perl.org to Freenode. Nothing against irc.perl.org. We just wanted to increase our visibility outside of the Perl sphere. Speaking of which, I got to pause for just a second for an unscheduled note here and just say the Mojo channel is very excited about the Perl 7 announcement, and we will definitely be on board with that. So we are very excited to play around with a newer, better runtime for ourselves. The Mojo Toolkit. So I'm going to have a bit of a theme here. I decided on it kind of late, but I think it works. So we got to find some droids. We have Mojo DOM, which lets you find and manipulate HTML or XML content using CSS3 and even some CSS4 selectors. We've backported a few things we really like from the CSS4 spec. Mojo JSON, we have a built-in JSON parser. It's pure Perl. It's, I think, the fastest pure Perl JSON parser. We do have integrations that if you have cPanel JSON XS installed, it will use those. And we have JSON pointers, which are kind of like CSS selectors for JSON. It just lets you dive into data easily. You'll see those a little bit in this talk too. And we have Mojo URL, lets you inspect and manipulate URLs as an object. There's lots of stuff involved in it, but at least a few of those are Mojo path and Mojo parameters, which operate on the path and the query elements of the URL object. We have Mojo user agent, which is a blocking and non-blocking user agent. A lot of people do use it for the blocking stuff, but it actually has great non-blocking interaction, obviously, given it's part of our toolkit. It has WebSockets as a first-class citizen, though we won't really do much WebSockets in this talk. And it's really well integrated with the other Mojo pieces that I've shown above and some that I haven't shown. We have Test Mojo. Starts a real server, unlike the Catalyst test runner, which ran a sort of a mock server. Because of Mojo's real-time interactions, it was deemed a better idea to start a real local server. But because Mojolicious has a local server built right in, it was really easy to do that. The test object contains one of those user agents we just talked about, has lots of test methods. There's a typo that I just see. It has lots of test methods included in it. It has a lot of format detection that we'll talk about, and of course, it can also test WebSockets, adding that for completeness. And some of the non-blocking bits. Mojolicious is deeply non-blocking. Even the blocking requests actually under the hood do non-blocking stuff that you don't see. It's based on Mojo IO loop, which has pluggable Mojo reactor classes for all different loops that you can find on cpan. A couple of years ago, we finally added Mojo Promise, which lets you use a promise style programming rather than the old callbacks. I was probably the last one to get pulled along kicking and screaming to promises from callbacks, but I did it because the promise that we've now delivered on of async await, which promises with async await are just magical, and you'll see that later on. Oh, and of course it comes with a web framework. So you get Mojolicious and you get Mojolicious Lite, which is DSL for Mojolicious. I've given a previous talk, if Lite versus full apps confuse you, I have an app that you can look for called Mojolicious Gardening. I should have probably put a link here, but they really aren't very different. Don't let the Lite app scare you. Well, we're starting out. Hello world. So the simplest Mojolicious application, it's a Lite application, and it handles the /route and it renders the text hello world. And the last line is just needed for a Lite app to start the server, or start the application, I should really say. And of course, I want to show you that it has tests, because testing is very important. You know, the test Mojo thing is right there for you. We import Mojo-based strict to get strict and warnings and things. We import test more and test Mojo to get our tester. We create an instance of test Mojo where we just sort of load the application. All of the applications in this talk, I show you the path down here, and I just made them easily. They each reference the app.pl in their own directory. All that architecture aside, this is the actual test. We ask the tester to get the slash route, and it tests that it successfully got something. We get test that the status is 200, and we test that the content is hello world. Now, what actually happened there? What you saw was that we had text encoded with UTF-8. That was what that text keyword was. The text keyword does not mean that the content type is text, like text plain. The default content type is text HTML. So probably the better, smallest app that you should write is this, because if you're rendering just text, you should also have a content type of text plain. And since the text keyword renders UTF-8 and does UTF-8 encoding, let's say hello globe, not hello world. And we have a format of text. And we can see those updates in our test file. We can test that we actually get a content type like text plain. You use content type like a lot of times because there's usually a car set appended to that, and nobody really cares about that very much. And then you have the content is, and obviously the content has changed there, but we can just use the UTF-8 in there as well, because Mojo base -strict also enables UTF-8 in all your files. Let's meet some new friends. A non-trivial app, or a pretty small app, but still not just that absolutely trivial app, is a hello user app. So because we're going to have a controller, I like to immediately go to use Mojolicious Lite -signatures. That enables the experimental signatures. And maybe that'll go away in Perl 7. That'll be exciting. This line does a lot of work. It says we're going to handle the /user route, where user is anything you pass in. That hash reference there gives it a default value. So if you don't give me a user, I will assume you meant globe. And we have the controller as the argument. We're going to pull that user out of the stash. Now the stash is just an extra hash reference that's passed around with the request. It's it's mostly there for your scratch use, though some of the keys do end up meaning things. And we're going to render hello user, where we just interpolate that in. In our tests, we have obviously the text plain as before. And in this case, we're going to check hello globe and also hello Greedo. By the way, Hotshot first. Can we do any other formats? Well, let's keep trying things, huh? So we have JSON handling, where the only thing that's really changed here is rather than rendering text, we're rendering JSON. You use the JSON key to render, and you can pass it a data structure that it'll serialize. You'll notice I didn't actually have to put the format here. That's because while the text rendering was sort of ambiguous for what format it was wanting, JSON, even though it is also a text format, you would never say you want to render JSON, but render it as some other content type. So the content type is handled for you. And we can do the same kind of tests as we did before. One thing that and as I said, you have the content type set for you. There are lots of JSON tests, but let me just first mention that you can test the entire object, or you can use those JSON pointers, as I mentioned before, to test subsets of the data. Now, in this case, we only rendered one key, so it wasn't all that different. But you can imagine if you had a big object and you really only cared about a few values, this might be an easier way to test it. Well, let's try some more things. Templates, because when you're rendering HTML, you don't want to do that. Again, a very similar controller. This time, we're just rendering the template. And you'll notice I didn't have to pull anything out of the stash, because the stash is just, the yellow is a little bit hard on that. So the stash becomes variables inside of the template. So that's the same value that was in the stash before, just as an injected variable in your template. One other thing I want to mention here, because now we're using tagged data, I don't actually have to include anything but the username inside of this tag. So while our tests before had to include this awkward exclamation point, we now can test without that. And we do it by passing in a CSS selector. The CSS selector says I want the div with the ID of greeting and the class, the paragraph for the, I think it was a div, wasn't it? Yes, the div with the class of user. So it's ID and class of user. And again, that all works as expected. Now I'm going to take this one step further, which we won't actually use in the remainder of the application, but because we've come this far, content negotiation. We have all these different ways we can render things, but what if the user wants to be able to pick which thing they want? So if the user asks for text, we render text. Now you'll notice again, I didn't have to include the format. And that's because the user has already requested the format. And because they requested it, we already know how to reply. They can request JSON. And it may look like I stuttered here where I called it JSON twice, but that's because the key on the left is saying when they request JSON, the key on the right is what I would pass to render. And the HTML one was the same as before, basically. So now we can test all kinds of things, like, you know, we get the original example, and HTML is the default. But if we ask for /.text, we get the text version. If we ask for /.json, we get the JSON version. The user variation of this also works, as you'd expect. There are a few other ways you can negotiate the content. You can send in an accept header of text plain, for example, or application JSON or whatever other values you'd like. And you could even do a question format equals text, so a format query parameter. I guess it's still useful. I don't try to do that for things like APIs, but some clients are a little more limited in the ways they can send things, so perhaps that might be a little more useful for you. Oh, come on, it's not a trap. All right, let's build this bigger app now that we have sort of the basic building blocks. Let's set a goal of displaying some docs fetched from MetaCpan. And MetaCpan has a nice endpoint for us that replies back with documentation. I smell problems coming. Here's the simple application itself. It was just a little bit too big to fit on the slide, so I hope you don't mind if I scroll just a hair, but I wanted you to see it in its entirety. We do the import of Mojolicious Lite. Well, meant to drop this import because we don't get that till the next slide, but I missed that. We have a configuration parameter wherein we pass the API endpoint. Now you may say, that's never going to change. Why do you want to have that in config? You'll see that in a moment. We also have a get doc helper. So a helper is sort of a reusable bit of code that you can share with the rest of your application. If this were a full app, that would probably be a controller method. But in a light app, it's convenient to make it a helper. Helpers get past the controller and any arguments, much like a routing action do. In this case, we pull the API string out of the config. We're going to just blindly string concat the URL, and we request that URL. Mojolicious applications have a user agent attached to them, so that's a handy way to just get a quick user agent object out. And we take the result and the resulting text, and we return it to the caller of the helper. And then here is our controller. It handles the /doc/module route, and it just calls that and renders it. But we're mocking an external, or we're using an external source, so we probably want to mock it in our tests. In this case, we'll use another Mojolicious application. It's really handy for that. Because you can only have one light application in a particular process for reasons you don't need to care about, it's actually really easy to just use a Mojolicious full app right in line. And we're just going to install one route onto it. It'll handle the pod/my_module route. Now remember, this application is pretending to be MetaCPAN, not our application. We're going to reply with just enough data in the format from MetaCPAN, but we don't actually need it to be a full content block, just enough for us to play around with it. So how do we use this mock? We are using the Mojo user agent under the hood of the tester, and that user agent actually has a handy little server attached to it. And that server is used if you ask for a relative URL rather than an absolute URL, meaning just a URL that starts with, say, /. And that server accepts a Mojolicious application. So we can attach this mock app to the main app's user agent. But we said before that you need it to be a relative URL to use that. Well, remember we set the MetaCPAN URL to be configurable. And that means we can do a config override in the test Mojo object. That new hash that I've passed in, where API just points at /, is what the application attached to that tester will use. Because of that, it has a relative URL, and because of that, it will use the mock that we install on the application. This is a really handy pattern. You can use it all the time. You can use several of these if you want. You have to be a little more careful about, you can't attach to just the user agent or the application's user agent, but I have used this for mocking several services at once, and it really is just a joy. So testing that simple app, you've already seen most of it. Let's just scroll through it a little bit. But it basically comes down to the same idea. We request the doc my_module route from our application. Internally, it requests the pod my_module from our fake MetaCPAN, and it gets back the data as we'd expect. But some of the content in there is not where we want to go. So let's work on some URL manipulation. We have a Mojo URL object, and I'm going to build a helper that returns me a Mojo URL object built from that API string in the config. We then call that helper to get the URL object in our get_doc helper. And one of the things that I really love about Mojo URL is that you can use the path as an array reference. So if you're doing lots of API manipulations, you're calling deep routes on a URL, you can just push the content onto it and get a new URL out of it. The rest of the method is the same. I showed you that because what I actually want to do is fix those URLs in the response, because any URLs that came back from MetaCPAN point at MetaCPAN. So let's use Mojo DOM and Mojo URL to transform that HTML. Now, we never use regex to manipulate our HTML because Mojo DOM is a more elegant weapon. One more change I'm going to make. to that get doc is to return the results DOM object. So there's a handy DOM method attached to the result object, and that gives you a DOM version of the parsed HTML result. And we will just call a Mojlinks helper that I'm going to show you in a second on that doc, and we'll get back a new doc, and we'll render that. Now, one other change I'm making here, I'm going to actually give that route a name. So the last object, the last parameter you can pass to a router object names the route. And in this case, I'm naming it doc. And that will mean I can refer to it by that name later. We take that DOM object that we just got, we call find on it, and we pass it a rather complex, well, or I should just say long, CSS selector that says, give me all of the anchor links that have a href that starts with metacpan. Now, I probably could have built that out of a Mojo URL too, if I was really saying that this was a pluggable application, but it really isn't a pluggable application. There's only one metacpan, so that was okay for this. What I will do is take that href, make a Mojo URL object out of it, take the path parts out of it, and we know that the last part is going to be the module that it references. So if there are links to other modules, we now know which module it's talking to. Now there are other URLs that metacpan returns. This is just a demonstration. If you really wanted to do this, you'd have to find a few other different types of URL it has, but this is good enough to demonstrate. Now that we have the module, we can use the URL for method. This lets us build a URL for a named route. And because that named route takes a module parameter, we pass it the name of the module, or the name of the route, which is doc, and the module that we're pointing at. And we put that back onto the href. And when all that is done, we return the DOM object. And we can test that transformation by just throwing in another random module that we link to from our mock. We can then test the response we get from our service and see that we have a href that is exactly /doc/othermod, which is the format that we need. And we can test that there are not elements that point to metacpan. Well, that was good, but that was only one request. And as I told you before, one request really isn't that hard to make non-blocking. So let's add a few more bits and bobs from metacpan. We're going to add the distribution name for that module, and we're going to add the number of ++. By the way, you know, I probably should have shown you. Which one was this last one? Let's do. Just have to start it, of course. Maybe we want to look at Mojo base. Should have shown you this before. Doc. Just to show you what it looks like. And you can see that our own links point to our own site, so I could click on that one, and we get roll time. Anyway, adding that extra data is as simple as adding a few more methods, and 2 of them get data, and 1 of them attaches that data to our documentation. Get dist for modules. So every module has a distribution it comes from, and much like the other one, it's just a different endpoint on MetaCPAN. However, this one returns JSON, so we're going to use a JSON parser and just say, all I care about is the distribution key on that object. Now to keep things a little bit tidy, I'm going to show you how I'm going to mock that. I'm going to add a second route that handles module, my module, and we render JSON with just a distribution of my mods. Say they both come from my mods. We also want the favorite count for that distribution. It's a slightly different query. The query has both the /favorite / search at the end, and a query parameter, which is distribution : dist. But because we have Mojo URL and we've already tied that together, that's also really easy to use. We get that result and we ask for the hits key and its total key to get the number of ++. Now, mocking it also is a little bit interesting. Now, you've noticed in our previous mocks, we ensure that we are handling only the expected data. That shows us that our mock is being used as we expect it to. But the query parameter is not something we can route on easily. So what I'm doing here is having it reply not found unless the query parameter is what we expect it to be. And then, assuming it is, we render a data structure that is compatible with what we expect from a CPAN. In this case, 123 ++. And we can have a helper like inject dist. Now, this helper calls render, but we don't want to render to the client. We want to render into a string. So we have a render to string method, and we're calling the template dist. We pass it dist and we pass it faves. Now remember, before we had things in the stash, so we didn't have to pass in arguments, but these values are not in the stash, so we have to pass them in as named parameters. They still get used as stashed parameters while we're in that template, but they are not in the global request stash. That's rendering, but now we have to get that document back into our final response. And I've chosen to say, why don't we put it in after the name field? Because people are expecting to get the named content back. But they probably won't care if we add an extra little header in there. So we're going to find the H1 named name, and then we're going to find the paragraph immediately after it. And then after that, we will append the HTML we've generated and return that DOM. So here's the full application. You've seen all the pieces. This is just scrolling through to show you how it is together. Now, as I said, this is a non-trivial application. So it's a little bit of code to look at. Again, if you want to look at it in more detail, go to the talk repository. We've called this one blocking app. I want to show you what that looks like. Where did my browser go? Here we go. So let's say we wanted roll tiny, because we used that one before. Roll tiny comes from the roll tiny dist, and it has 52, only 52 ++ on MetaCPAN. You guys need to go fix that. Go and ++ roll tiny. Now the full test, you've already seen the mocks for this. So you can expect that the test basically is the same as before. We have a slightly more complex test because now we want to ensure that there's a tag at H1 name, and then the P after that, and then the href after that. Then the H1 after that we call distribution and P, and we check that it contains the content that we expected. Now that's a pretty complex CSS query, and you can imagine if you were trying to regex for that, you would have a really hard time. But with CSS selectors, once you learn those, it's really easy. But now it's time. We have to make it async. And I know for some of you, this is not a pretty concept. So there are 3 basic mechanisms for async, at least in Mojolicious, but they're the 3 basic ones I'm aware of. Callbacks, and you can still do callbacks. They're old school and they're not really worth it anymore. I was one of the last people holding on to it. If I'm telling you you don't want to do callbacks anymore, you don't want to do callbacks anymore. Promises. Promises were a huge upgrade to handling callbacks. A promise is an object that represents the possible future actions that will happen after an asynchronous action happens. The nice thing about this is there's a certain sort of inversion of control that happens where callbacks, the caller, the function you called was responsible for doing stuff. With a promise, you are responsible for attaching what else gets to happen. And there's a really good YouTube talk. It's Node.js focused. But if you really are interested in sort of the deeper internals of why promises are better, go find from the Mojolicious Advent calendar a few years ago my talk about async await, or my article about async await, and find the link in there. It's really great. Those promises are chainable. Those promises handle exceptions, all in ways that are much better than callbacks. But they're still really non-trivial. And then we got async await. Now, async await uses promises, but it's so much more powerful than that. In Mojolicious, we just recently added support for async await. It requires the module future async await, and I have to commend Leonard, Paul Evans for working on this module, and then for working with us to help us get it integrated into Mojolicious. But now what we've got is really pretty seamless. So what is async await? Well, there are 2 new keywords. One of them is await, and the await keyword takes a promise, and it does some really crazy magic. It suspends the interpreter until the promise resolves, in which case it returns the result. Yet another typo here. It returns the result. And if the promise rejects, it throws the error. So you can just call a function that returns a promise and call await on it and get the resulting value out of the promise, not the promise itself. And you'll notice there's no callback at all. We just got asynchronous code that behaves like synchronous code. And that's been sort of the thing that everyone's been looking for all this time. There is one slight catch, which is you can only call await from inside of an async function. Oh, and I should have said before, while it's suspended, the interpreter actually goes and does other things. So it is non-blocking, even though that particular bit appears to be blocking. That should be obvious, I guess, given that I'm covering it in the async section, but I should say it out loud. Anyway, inside of an async sub, you can call the await method. But an interesting thing about async subs is they always return promises themselves. So this sort of system chains up on itself. And all of a sudden, async is easy. You can follow a pretty simple recipe. You await anything that returns a promise, especially await anything that is marked as async, because anything marked as async will also return a promise. And then mark any function that you want to use the await keyword in as async. And that's really it, at least in a Mojolicious app. There's a little bit more stuff you have to do to actually set this up if you're going to do it in like a script or something. It's totally possible, but because the Mojolicious application has it already built in, you don't even have to like do any of the setup. You just mark some subs as async. So how do we use it? We call the import of Mojolicious Lite, this time with an additional flag of -async await. And by convention in Mojolicious, any method that returns a promise we call _p. It's just a handy visual representation for us to be able to see that promises are expected rather than values. So we've changed getDoc to getDoc _p. We've marked the sub async. And then we also await a call to the user agent's getP method. But there's no callbacks. There's no callback hell. There's no arrow code. There's no, confusion of what's going on. And we're just going to do the same for getDist and the same for getFavorites. We call each of those in turn with await. Now, if you really wanted to optimize, in theory, you could be getting the documentation at the same time as we're getting the distribution and the favorites. And that's not all that much harder, but you don't need to. Since you're non-blocking, all you're really saying is it's going to take just a hair longer for your client to get the response, but it doesn't block in this form either. And so now your full application looks almost exactly like it did before. I don't see a callback among them. And gloriously, the tests are completely unchanged. So are there any questions? Now you can all go make async apps without any problem at all. Todd, are you? Oh, here we got raised hands.
Yeah, so let's go with Mike first.
Okay, let me move this over here so it doesn't look like I'm staring off into space.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I've got an app that I'm using the sub-process IO loop for, and I'm using runp to actually fork off that sub-process. I'm very curious about the interplay between the IO loop, the sub-processes that are actually spawned off, and promises. But I'm also wondering what the role of like Morbo or Hypnotoad does when it comes to things like that. Because I've noticed every once in a while, I get like 4 different processes that are running that I wasn't expecting to be running. And I'm wondering, like, is the process model for some of that stuff impacted by Hypnotoad or any of those other those runners? Is any of the other async await or promise stuff also impacted by that? Yeah, I know that's probably not a very clear question.
No, I get more or less what you're saying. As far as I'm aware, let me back up and let's take it out of Hypnotoad, where for people who don't know, Hypnotoad is the pre-forking web server that does hot swappable servers, so like you can do a hot restart. If we're just talking about a single process web server, as far as I'm aware, there shouldn't be any problem doing async await and the sub-process _p. That said, sub-process p is some really, I shouldn't say magical code. It's not magical, but it does a lot of low-level system things. And I wouldn't want to promise you that, how about this? Any bug that would exist in that would probably also exist in Hypnotoad, certainly.
Okay.
I can't imagine there would be any more bugs than would be, if you use async await with it. They're very different subsystems. Paul Evans would be better to ask about that, but I can't imagine that that would be any different. And if you're having problems, if you're getting processes you don't expect, why don't you hop into the Mojo channel and let's diagnose, because it shouldn't be happening, though it's not unheard of depending on when and where you're forking. So let's, we'd be happy to take a peek at it with you if you have something you can show us.
Okay, yeah. The async await and promise stuff is really cool. I've done a lot of stuff with JavaScript, and this feels very much like what I already am familiar with there.
To step back for a second, when I said that I was the last one hanging on to callbacks, it was actually seeing async await in JavaScript that was like, oh no, we got to have this. So I was banging the door down all of a sudden for promises and for async await because of JavaScript. I wanted that for Perl.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, I have a question. Is a promise the same thing as a continuation?
No, a continuation really is the callbacks that I've been saying.
A continuation is a function which, when you call it, does the rest of the computation.
I mean, from a most generic standpoint, then I guess that's probably the same thing. But it's more of a matter of who's holding the closure, the code reference that's going to be called afterwards. And typically you call continuation passing when you pass a callback into the function, whereas the promises pattern is when the function that's going to be asynchronous returns to you an object that you attach things to. It's about the control layer, who has the control of what, and in another sense, it's also having a separate exception channel that is well defined, as opposed to in callbacks, in continuation passing. It's sort of a convention to pass the error as the first argument, but there's no enforcement that that's going to be true. So it's really hard to make sort of generic wrappers, where in promises, generic wrappers are easy because there's a separate exception channel.
Huh. Okay, thank you.
If that's interesting to you, I do highly recommend, let me see if I can quickly find Mojolicious. So there's a Mojolicious.io, which has the Mojolicious calendar from, the last one was in 2018. I was too busy to do one last year. But if you look on the 2018 day 24, so December 24th, 2018 post to the Mojolicious.io blog, there's a really awesome YouTube video that you can watch. It is JavaScript focused, but it will talk you all the way through why promises are better and then why async await is better.
Okay, thank you. You said that was December 24th, 18?
There we go, right here. Any more questions?
Hi, yes, I have a question. It's I'm not very familiar on the web design end, and I'm looking for just some very straightforward apps, maybe some kind of a CRUD that could start up. What do you recommend for that? I see you've got a Galileo that's sitting on your GitHub site.
Galileo was a fun experiment of mine, and I would love to make a second version of it, but it is oddly too focused on WebSockets, and that was partially because at the time I was just really excited for WebSockets. It works, I assume. I haven't used it in a long time. If you're making a new sort of cruddy API, do you want one that you write or one that's pre-built for you?
Well, as much pre-built then that I could tear apart as needed to fool around with.
I might, for the pre-built, I might suggest you look at Doug Bell's Yancy, Y-A-N-C-Y. He's been putting a lot of effort into that, and while I haven't actually kept up on it as much as I should, there are actually some Yancy posts in the Mojolicious.io blog. or Doug, I'm sure would be happy to talk to you. He's pre-action on most places you can find him. If you were looking to write something on your own, I would suggest you look at the Open API plugin for Mojolicious. I really like the Open API, like generating the routing table from your API spec is really a lovely way to keep your documentation and your validation and your application all in sync with each other. So those would be my 2 suggestions, sort of depending on how much you want to write it or how much you want it pre-built for you.
Very good. Thank you.
Doug Bell is also giving a talk in 2 hours.
Probably
Yes,
on Yancey, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay, unless anybody else wants to raise their hands, I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Joel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Enjoy the conference, and I will hope to see you around virtually at various places. If you have any other questions of Mojo or anything else, please feel free to talk to me. I'm always happy to talk to people.